I feel very excited to be introducing our next speaker, who happens to also be a very dear friend who I hope one of these days will be allowed back into the country. So, so Dr. Rachael Dunlop, who you would, I'm certain, know as Dr. Rachie, is a senior research fellow at Brain Chemistry Labs in Jackson, Wyoming. Her current work focuses on L-serine as a therapy in neurodegenerative diseases. Her team's discovery of L-serine as a neuroprotective agent fast-tracked the treatment from the bench to the bedside, where 2 FDA-approved clinical trials for Alzheimer's and ALS are underway. Today, Dr. Rachie will be dissecting the FDA approval of the first treatment for Alzheimer's disease in over 20 years. One would expect this would be something to be terribly excited about, but the approval went ahead despite 10 of the 11 members of an independent advisory committee voting not to approve the drug. So today, Rachael will look at the highly controversial FDA decision, as well as exploring why so many therapies for neurodegenerative diseases have failed. Rachel, I shall hand over to you, and you should have control of your slides. I am hoping that is all up and running.
Okay, thank you, Jo. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so it's Saturday night here in Jackson, Wyoming. I live on the edge of Grand Teton National Park, which you can see in this first slide. It's a very beautiful, remote wilderness that I am very lucky to be able to experience. But today I'm going to talk to you about the new Alzheimer's drug that has been developed by Biogen. It's marketed as Aduhelm, and I have 10 reasons why I believe this should not have been approved. So let's just go to the next slide. So I do have a conflict of interest, which I'm going to declare up front. Myself and the not-for-profit that I work for, we have patents pending for a different treatment for neurodegenerative disease, which Jo just mentioned, which is called L-serine. So take that as you wish. So just in brief, this is a new treatment for Alzheimer's, but also for mild cognitive impairment, which is kind of an early stage Alzheimer's disease. In Australia, there is about 3 in 10 people over the age of 85 have some kind of dementia, which could include Alzheimer's. That's predicted to increase by 2050 to, about 900,000 people will be living with this drug. This is with this disease. This is extremely expensive. It's extremely emotionally difficult for carers and for families, in particular because there's currently no cure for this disease, and there are drugs, but they generally just treat the symptoms, and they're not particularly good at that. So one of the problems with designing drugs for neurodegenerative diseases, including Alzheimer's disease, is that the only real way to diagnose it unequivocally is post-mortem, and that can be done using neuropathology, and it has this very characteristic neuropathology where you have 2 kinds of sticky misfolded proteins that appear in the brain tissue, and one is called neurofibrillary tangles, which are formed by tau, a protein called tau, and tau basically, normally it is involved in like a scaffolding in the cell, and it forms a transport system that can carry nutrients and waste around the neuron. But in the case of neurodegeneration, this tau becomes misfolded, it becomes sticky, it gets phosphorylated, and it forms these tangles called neurofibrillary tangles. And then these form inside the neurons, but we also have another very characteristic neuropathology called amyloid plaque. And this is where a protein called amyloid beta, it also forms sticky, messy plaques in the spaces between the neurons. And in healthy brain, it plays an important role in growth and repair of nerves and neurons. But in Alzheimer's disease, it forms these plaques, and eventually the cells die. So these plaques, these neurofibrillary tangles and plaques, they form in parts of the brain that are associated with memory, learning, reasoning, and emotion, which is how we manifest the loss of memory in Alzheimer's. But what is particularly interesting about this is that, yes, we find these neuropathology in post-mortem tissue from Alzheimer's patients. You can also image them using PET scanning and MRI scanning in live people. But the correlation is not necessarily causation, as skeptics know very well. So even though they're here, are they causing the disease? Well, that's a really good question. Oops, I forgot to forward my slide, didn't I? Oops. So with Alzheimer's, oops, I'll just go back, that was too far. So as Joe mentioned in the introduction, there have not been any new drugs to treat Alzheimer's for about 18 years. Drugs that are designed against Alzheimer's have a failure rate of about 99%, which is pretty spectacular. Now, part of the reason for this is that we don't know what causes most neurodegenerative diseases, and so it's very difficult to then design a way to prevent them or slow them if you don't know what causes them. In addition, when it comes to neurons, they are post-mitotic, which basically means they don't divide and renew like other cells do. So for example, hair cells or skin cells, they renew very fast, they rapidly repair, they make new ones. Neurons are not that plastic in terms of repairing and making new ones. So once you've lost them, you tend to not get very many new ones replacing them. So in the last 18 years, billions of dollars have been spent on designing new drugs for neurodegeneration, including Alzheimer's. And many, many farmers have targeted these two particular sticky proteins that I talked about, these that are characteristic of the neuropathology. So I'm just going to go back to that slide since I forgot to, I actually didn't click onto it. I apologize for that. So these two particular proteins here, which is the neurofibrillary tangles formed by misfolded tau and the amyloid plaques, the prevailing sort of dogma of what causes Alzheimer's is that amyloid plaques are causative. And so Pharma have designed drugs to target these plaques and to try to pull them out of the brain. And they do this using antibodies, which is really fascinating. So they can send antibodies to the site of where these plaques are, and they can effectively remove these. And that's been shown to be really quite effective in terms of a therapy. However, sorry about this. This is skipping forward. So Eli Lilly designed a drug that does this, and it's in the same class that Biogen has designed, which has just been approved. This was called solanezumab, MAB meaning monoclonal antibody. Their trial failed in 2018 and was just determined a catastrophic fail. And then Roche had a very similar drug that targeted the same neuropathology. Their trial failed in 2020 and was called a flop. And as a result of the fact that so much money has been thrown at this problem and so much time and so much research, some farmers now have said, that's it, we're done, we're pulling out of this research altogether. The other problem that you see in trying to slow or revert the process of Alzheimer's disease is that some of these plaques and these amyloids build up many, many years before symptoms appear. So in some cases, you get these amyloid plaque proteins appearing 15 to 20 years before symptoms appear. So you're really kind of trying to, there's a train crash heading down the track and the train's already crashed, everyone's died, then you're trying to go in and stop the train from crashing, and it's kind of too late at that point. So let's go on to Biogen's new drug. So this was approved by the FDA in the US in June 2021. It's marketed as Aduhelm, also known as aducanumab. It's an antibody. It's designed to treat mild cognitive impairment or early stage Alzheimer's disease, and it's designed to slow cognitive decline. So obviously the major problem in Alzheimer's is that people lose their memory and they decline to a stage where they forget people, they forget who they are, they forget everything. So it was designed to stop this. And the way that Biogen did this is they targeted these sticky plaques that I mentioned called amyloid beta. And it is administered by monthly infusion as an antibody. Now, they designed these clinical trials. So they had 2 different clinical trials running concurrently. They decided that in March 2019, they would have a look at the data that they collected, have a little peek and see whether or not this was working. And they decided in March 2019, following a pre-specified interim analysis, that the trials had failed. So they actually cancelled the trials, they terminated them in March 2019. However, this is where the controversy starts. So even though they terminated those trials, they said this drug doesn't work. They then did a secondary analysis after the fact, which they hadn't planned for. And they found in one of the clinical trials, in the highest dose of this drug, Aduhelm, there was a subgroup of patients who did slightly better on the cognition tests. So it did slow cognition in a subgroup of patients by about 22%, or around 4 months over an 18-month period. So these patients gained an extra 4 months of cognition in which they didn't decline. And so the FDA then decided that they would give this drug accelerated approval. And this was based on the fact that the drug was removing these sticky plaques from the brain. But I want to reiterate what I said earlier, is that every other drug that's been designed to remove these sticky plaques from the brain has never shown to reduce cognitive decline. And in addition, this is not how you do science. You can't get your results and then go back and cherry pick your data to try to find a subgroup of patients for which it works. That's not how you do clinical trials. In any case, FDA did give it approval, and what they did approve it based on was what is called a surrogate measure. And this means that Biogen doesn't have to prove that the drug works. They just have to show that it pulls these plaques out of the brain. And now they are going to go and do what's called a phase 4 trial, and they have another 9 years now to demonstrate that it works. So this to me is extremely problematic. And so I've put together 10 reasons why I don't think this drug should have been approved. So here we go with those. I'm going to count down to number 1. So part of the problem, which I've kind of emphasized up to this point, is that this hypothesis that this amyloid plaque causes disease has not shown to be true. In the case of lots of other big pharmas have designed drugs to target this beta amyloid. When they remove it from the brain, it doesn't slow cognition. And one of the criticisms that this drug has received now that it's been approved is that it's flogging this dead horse of this hypothesis of amyloid. And now it's going to divert research and development money away from possibly more efficacious and safer pathways for drugs to treat Alzheimer's. Number 9 reason why it shouldn't have been approved is that it was originally, so when it was first approved in June 2021, the FDA approved it for all patients who have Alzheimer's, of which there's approximately 6 million in the US. But the clinical trials only tested patients who had mild cognitive impairment, which is very, very early stage Alzheimer's, or early stage Alzheimer's, not for everybody, not for people that have mild to moderate or severe disease, but the FDA approved it for everybody. And one of the clinicians who actually worked on one of the clinical trial sites, his comment on this was that there's no evidence that this drug can be beneficial for any other stage of Alzheimer's apart from the ones they tested in the trials. So this is really dodgy as well. You can't just suddenly, choose a different set of patients that you didn't test in the clinical trial and say, well, they can take this drug too. That's poor, bad science. So the other thing that I've already covered in quite a lot of detail is that this drug was approved for a surrogate endpoint, which means it's not a clinical outcome. So you do not need to show that the drug works. And indeed, in my opinion, Biogen did not show that this drug reduces cognitive decline. The FDA decided that because it pulls out these sticky plaques out of the brain, that it would likely result in a clinical benefit down the track. Likely results. So now they've said to Biogen, okay, you guys, you have 9 years now to do a phase 4 confirmatory trial, and then get back to us and let us know if it does reduce cognitive decline. And so what can happen after 9 years, if Biogen still does not have evidence it works, the FDA can pull the drug. So the number 7 reason why this drug should not be approved is that it sidelines other drugs that actually have been shown to work. So although there are not many drugs around for the treatment of Alzheimer's or early stage Alzheimer's, there are a couple, and one is called memantine. This has been around for a couple of decades. It's off patent now. And this is an NMDA receptor antagonist. And there's also a class of drug called acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, and they are sold under the name galantamine. And there was a recent meta-analysis done of the effects of galantamine, and it showed that patients who took this drug virtually never declined past moderate stage dementia. So these drugs actually work. They've been around for a couple of decades. They do actually slow decline. They're off patent, they're really cheap, they're really safe. You can get, for example, with galantamine, it comes as a tablet, an extended long release, slow acting capsule as a solution. But, you know, they're not fancy and they're not on patent. And yeah, they've kind of been sidelined as a result of the approval of this fancy antibody. So the number 6 reason that it shouldn't have been approved is it gives false hope. So I've seen a couple of reports from Australia where they've talked to patients, and you know, this is a disease that is extremely difficult for everybody involved. Anyone who's got a relative or a friend who's got Alzheimer's will know how emotionally draining it is and how terrible it is for everyone. So as soon as you get the stamp of approval from the FDA, of course, everyone's going to want this drug because it lends legitimacy, and of course you expect it's going to work if the FDA has approved it. And Biogen themselves have said that there are strong indications of very high initial patient interest. However, curiously, since it was approved in June 2021 here in the US, they've only sold about $2 million worth of drug. And in fact, one of the executives from Biogen has blamed the controversy surrounding this drug and the fact that people are criticizing it for them not selling enough. So, you know, boo-hoo to them. So giving false hope, I think, is one of the most, you know, abhorrent things about it. It's extremely expensive. So it hasn't been approved in Australia yet, but in the US, it costs $56,000 per year per patient. Now, this doesn't include any other clinical costs associated with the infusion of the drug, because as I mentioned, it's an antibody. It has to be infused monthly. And because in the clinical trial, the patients that took the drug, they experienced some quite severe side effects, including brain swelling. And so if you are being given this drug, you have to have MRIs to look for side effects and to also look for reduction in these amyloid plaques. And so, I mean, in the US, of course, this is an out-of-pocket expense, or if your insurance will cover it, which is different to the structure in Australia, but it's still extremely expensive for something that basically might not work. Number 4 reason is the risks outweigh the benefits. So I just alluded to this a minute ago, that in the clinical trials, patients on the high dose drug experienced very serious side effects, including brain swelling and bleeding. And this was 35% of patients in the high dose cohort in these clinical trials had these side effects. And here's one of the biggest problems with this, is that some of these side effects also overlap with underlying disease progression. So now you have to try to discriminate between, well, is this just the disease manifesting in this patient, or is the drug causing this to happen? I'm not really sure how clinicians are going to separate that. They do have to do regular MRIs as a result to monitor these side effects. And then in addition, this is an invasive administration in as much as an infusion is invasive. And so the risks really do outweigh the benefits in this case. Now, here's another part of the controversy that kind of got the backup of Biogen, is that when this drug was, before it was approved, all the data was sent to an independent advisory committee, which consists of neurologists and neuroscience experts, and they assess the evidence, and then they submit a recommendation to the FDA to say, hey, we should definitely approve this or we should not. Now, 10 of these independent committee members, independently assessing this evidence, they recommended this drug not be approved. And the one remaining member who didn't recommend it, wasn't approved, he abstained from making a recommendation because he said there's not enough evidence for me to make a decision here. Now, curiously, the FDA went ahead and approved it anyway. And so as a result of that, 3 members of the independent committee actually quit. And then this was also partly to do with the fact that the FDA and Biogen collaborated on reanalyzing this data. after the trial was terminated in March 2019. And this arrangement has been criticised as potentially compromising the FDA's objectivity. Do you reckon? So that's a bit dodgy. So the number 2 reason why this drug should not have been approved. Now, clinicians don't really want to prescribe it. Quite a few have said that they don't want to prescribe it. Here in the US, the Cleveland Clinic and Mount Sinai's health system have said they don't want to prescribe it. The Department of Veterans Affairs in America will not prescribe it for their veterans. They just don't think there's enough good evidence to show that the risks outweigh the benefits. And of course, it's extremely expensive for them to fund as well. So that's probably playing a role. But this is going to create issues between patients and clinicians, because patients will want to access it and clinicians are saying, well, we're not going to do it. But really the biggest reason why this drug should not have been approved by the FDA, and given the imprimatur of the FDA and therefore lends it legitimacy, is it probably doesn't work. It probably doesn't work to slow cognitive decline in early stage Alzheimer's or mild cognitive impairment. And I've already mentioned that, they ran 2 very large clinical trials concurrently. They collected the data from those clinical trials, and there was not enough evidence in those clinical trials to demonstrate that this drug could slow cognitive decline. And it was only after they went back and did a secondary analysis of the data, which they did not plan at the beginning of the trials, which is a big, big no-no for science. You can't go and massage your numbers after the fact to get the answer you want. That they found this very weak evidence of benefit, which was 22% of the patients, or a 4-month out of 18-month slowing of cognitive decline in the high dose cohort. But that was after they essentially cherry picked the data. And then the FDA approved it based on a surrogate endpoint, which is not a clinical outcome. It's essentially that it's removing these sticky proteins from the brain. But they did not approve it based on the fact that it will slow cognitive decline. So the overall sort of feeling from many scientists and many clinicians is that the evidence is insufficient to conclude that the clinical benefits of Aduhelm outweigh its harms, or indeed that it reduces progression of Alzheimer's disease. And this is one of the independent advisory committee members. His name is Dr. Aaron Klessenbaum. I think that's how you pronounce it. Kesselheim, I'm sorry. He actually quit as a result of approval of this drug. And his comment was, this might be the worst approval that the FDA has made that I can remember. So this has really created a lot of controversy, and I think it's going to be an ongoing issue, particularly for patients who are desperate to find anything, obviously, because there is no good treatment for Alzheimer's disease. It is a huge problem. It's getting more prevalent with an aging population. And now that we've got the stamp of approval from the FDA on a drug, you expect it to work, and it probably doesn't work. So that's it for me. And this is a photo of, I'm just going to skip slide, sorry. This is a photo of a moose in my backyard the other day. And you can find all you need to know about me on my website, drrachael.net. Thank you.
Well, I don't know about everyone else, but I feel my rage rising.
It's also pretty depressing, isn't it, when you think about it?
It's very depressing, and I guess I'm responding to this partly because of my own work. I've been a research nurse working in oncology trials for over 10 years now, and so hearing you describe the process of how this drug was approved just leaves me just absolutely gobsmacked, because it just goes against everything I know of a sound drug approval process. Everything you've said about the use of surrogate endpoints, just the going back and looking at this sort of subgroup, it's everything we know shouldn't be done.
100%. Like you can't redesign the protocol once you get the results, and that's essentially what they did. Is they cherry picked the data to find a subgroup of patients to which there was a small effect, and somehow the FDA bought that. And so this is really bad for patients and for their carers, because
No, go. Sorry, I apologize.
Well, no, I was just going to say, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the risks outweigh the benefits. And, you know, we're not talking about, we're talking about a serious drug that, you know, requires invasive administration, costs $56,000 a year without all the clinical care associated with it. And it provides false hope. And it's just bad all over. You know, I mean, this is the kind of reason that Big Pharma gets a bad reputation, right? I mean, it's just a classic case of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think, and I need to really get started on questions because we have quite a few, but it actually is quite interesting because, you know, the way we get accused of being in the pockets of Big Pharma, it'd be quite interesting to see how a lot of our critics would cope with the cognitive dissonance of hearing how vocally critical we are of Pharma and the FDA in moments like this.
Yeah.
So just jumping to questions. So first of all, I might actually just start. Apologies, James Milton, but you've asked a million questions over the weekend, which is much appreciated, but I'm just going to give someone else a go. Linda Tulberg, I'll start with yours. Could a change in leadership at the FDA lead to a change in the decision?
I don't know. I don't know if that's possible. I think now that they've been given the green light to do this phase 4 confirmatory trial, I'd say that that's going to proceed over the next 9 years, and they've got a second chance now. And if they can show that they slow cognitive decline, that they will get full approval. But yeah, I don't know how the machinations of the politics of the FDA work in that regard. So I don't know.
Okay. All right. So one of James's questions, first of all, how do we publicly address the real crimes of Big Pharma without empowering and being appropriated by or being lumped with the conspiracy theorists and anti-vax groups?
Well, I think in this case, you don't have to do much of a Google search to find there's plenty of other high-profile scientists and clinicians criticizing this decision. So this would not just be coming from skeptic groups that, you know, no one's ever heard of. There's been op-eds in the Journal of American Medical Association. It's been very, very highly criticized by a large group of people. And so I don't think this is would be considered an issue of a bunch of screeching banshees from, you know, Australia and New Zealand, if you like.
And when you say there's been criticism, clearly, you know, there's been a lot of criticism from experts. You know, quite often one of the groups obviously heavily involved are advocacy groups and patients themselves. Where do they sit with this? This must be very challenging.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and the short answer is they are very happy about it. They're very pleased about it. There has been some suggestion that patient advocacy groups are part of the reason for this approval, because they were just screaming, saying, where is a drug for Alzheimer's? You guys have had, you know, 20 years and you've just had nothing, and we need something. And so this was like a tiny kernel of potential that the FDA found, and they were lobbied very hard by patient advocacy groups, and I believe that probably contributed to this approval. But the American Alzheimer's Association heralded it as, you know, a turning point, so they are happy about it.
Yeah, that is very problematic. So a question from another question from Craig Shearer, actually. Does kicking up a stink with the FDA about the inappropriate approval cause the public to mistrust drugs that are efficacious and approved?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know, because I've never come across anything this blatant before. And I've never come across, I mean, I haven't really paid that much attention to the FDA, to be fair, until this happened. I mean, this is my area of research, so that's why I'm particularly interested. But it has potential to do that, sure. I mean, why not? Because, of course, it's not unreasonable to expect that the FDA would only approve something if it's efficacious and it's safe. And this is a mistake, in my opinion. And, you know, I wouldn't be unreasonable for people then to tar them with the same brush for other drugs at all. Absolutely, that's a possibility.
I'll ask one last question from James Milton and then we'll wrap up. If drugs like this are approved in countries like Australia, which have a pharmaceutical benefits scheme, do you think that would encourage practitioners to prescribe such drugs, and how would we combat this?
Yeah, well, I did find an article where Greg Hunt said that he was hoping the PBS would list it. I know it hasn't been approved by the TGA yet, but yeah, I think that it's extremely expensive, so I'm not sure how it's going to work. But yeah, patients will definitely want it for
And the
sure.
TGA does, of course, rely on the evidence that's been assessed by the
Of
FDA in
course,
making their decisions, so
of
that
course,
will inform
of
that.
course.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is not unreasonable. So yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
Oh, look, that's really, really troubling. And, I think if there's one note that we can just end this on, in the past 18 months, the public has become very much more aware of the approval process because of the way the COVID vaccines have been approved. And so I suppose in some way, if there's any positive that comes out of these things, it's a way to actually educate the public about the approval process and, when it can be trusted and when it can't be trusted.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, people make mistakes, but when it involves patients who are vulnerable, it's very bad. That's what I think's happened here.
Well, Dr. Rachael, thank you for enlightening us on this incredibly interesting and disturbing area of Big Pharma. And thank you for all the mooses. And we hope to see you back on our shores soon.